Hello everyone and welcome to our latest webinar, the best lenses and accessories for the Sony FS7 camera. Thanks for joining us. My name is Rob Newton, Marketing Manager here at Visual Impact, and I'm your host for this session. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Alister Chapman, an experienced DOP and certified trainer for Sony. Hello Alister.
Good morning Rob, good morning everyone listening in.
Alister has 25 years of experience working in the broadcast industry, shooting commercials and documentaries, plus he's been traveling the world running workshops and training sessions, so a vast knowledge of what works best in the field, and we're really fortunate and lucky to have him here today to do our presentation. Before we get started, I just want to go through some housekeeping bits and pieces. On your screens there's a question box. Please use it. We want to make this presentation as engaging as possible. Ask plenty of questions, and I'm sure Alistair will be able to answer them all at the end of this presentation.
I'm just going to interrupt there actually, Rob, because one thing on the last one we did that came through is it actually takes a few seconds, or maybe a few minutes in some cases, for the questions to arrive at us.
Sure.
So start asking those questions right now so that they'll get in our question queue, and then we can start looking at which ones need to be answered and get those answers ready for you.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. You may not know that we actually run open days, masterclass sessions and product launches here in Teddington. So if you're interested in getting your hands on the kit, check out our website www.visuals.co.uk for more details. Before we get started, I just want to run an audience poll really. This will help Alistair adopt his presentation to the profile of the audience so we know who's listening and out there. So the question is, have you made the leap to a large sensor? So there's various options you can see on the screen now. So it's either not sure if it's for me, no, but we need some, we know we need to go to there, and no, but almost there, or I'm not really sure if it's for me. So you've got various options. If you can just select which works best for you, and then we can have an idea, as I say, of who's actually joining us today.
So just keep clicking away on those options. A few of you left to vote. We can see how many of you are logged in and how many are voting. So it's still waiting for a couple more before we move on.
Sure.
So far, it's are we going to start revealing what the results are so far, perhaps, or is that going to bias the voting?
Yes, I think so. Maybe we reveal that at the end just to make it a bit more exciting. Okay, maybe we can start then. If you want to just close the poll now, and as I say, we'll reveal those results later on. Okay, I'd like to hand over to Alistair now to begin the webcast, and as I say, keep the questions rolling in, and I'll join you later on in the webinar. Thank you very much.
I think just one thing, yes, so just a reminder again, actually, questions, keep those questions coming in. We have one or two already, so we'll get onto those questions as soon as we can. Initially though, just a bit of a background on me, what I do. I shoot all kinds of things over the years. I've shot everything from motorsports, motor racing, windsurfing, snowboarding, to drama. I did a lot of editing as an online editor for a while, doing series such as Secret History for Channel 4, things like that, high-end, actually a lot of grading work in an old tape-based edit suite, so I have a reasonably good knowledge of grading and stuff like that. And more recently, specialising in shooting severe and extreme weather, made a couple of programs for National Geographic and Discovery, actually my own production company being directly commissioned by them to make some programs. One of the biggest ones I made was called Twister Tours for National Geographic, and it was quite a big experience for me. I learned a lot as being the person directly commissioned by the broadcaster about how broadcasters work inside. And that was really interesting. So now I travel the world, primarily to the US, shooting storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, all sorts of stuff like that, with various cameras. And about, what was it, 5 years ago, no, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I made the switch to large sensors with various cameras, DSLRs, Sony's F5, F55, and now I own both an FS5 and an FS7. FS7 is a really great camera. I use that for a lot of run and gun. It's ergonomically very good for that type of thing, so it actually suits the storm chasing, northern lights shooting, Arctic shooting, things like that. It's very portable, so it's very easy to carry around. Now, one of the key subjects that we're going to cover today is lens choices and accessorizing your FS7, for want of a better word. The camera comes from Sony in two possible options: the basic FS7 camera body only, or with the 28 to 135 millimeter zoom lens. And I'm going to talk about that zoom lens in a little bit because it is a very interesting lens, perhaps not for everybody. But whether you buy the lens option or you buy just the basic camera, you do have lots and lots of options with this camera for lenses. And that comes about because the camera has a mount called the E-mount, which is Sony's own mount, also on their NEX cameras and the new A7S, A7R cameras. And because this has a very short flange back, so that's the distance from the mount to the sensor, you can add all kinds of adapters to the camera to fit almost any lens that you want. In fact, I've really pretty much yet to come across a lens that you can't put on the FS7 if you've got the right adapter. So there are a huge number of options for this camera, and it can be very confusing because where do you go? One of the things that I sort of encountered with the FS7 was initially I just had the FS7, so I bought a adapter which was actually from a company called Comlight, very similar to a Metabones adapter, that allowed me to use Canon lenses on the camera, and that worked very well. But then I also got the Sony A7S, and I started buying some Sony E-mount lenses. So I then ended up with two different types of lenses, and it's like, well, do I stick with Canon mount or do I stick with E-mount? Where do I spend the money? And I wanted to have basically one type of lens mount rather than several. So it's easy to get confused in this area because there are so many options. And looking at lens adapters, just looking at the lens adapters on their own for a minute, you have the Metabones and other adapters that will go from that Sony E-mount to Nikon to Canon, and there are lots of options there, and they're normally just a direct mechanical adapter. In the case of a Nikon adapter, it's going to be purely mechanical, and it will control the aperture of the lens mechanically. Then you have also adapters like the Metabone Speed Booster, and this is an optical adapter. We'll talk about the difference in a moment. You also have PL lens adapters to use the movie industry standard PL lenses. Opens up a huge range of lenses that you can use. One note about PL mount: if you do go with PL mount, especially with some of the longer and heavier lenses, is the E-mount itself is, you have to remember this, essentially a DSLR lens mount. So it is reasonably strong, but it isn't very strong. So if you're putting heavy lenses on the camera, you may need to add extra support for those lenses to stop them drooping, to stop them overloading the lens mount. Another option is the MTF-B 4 to 2/3 inch E-mount system. So that allows you to put an ordinary 2/3 inch ENG lens on the FS7 and other cameras as well, in fact, and that does open up a lot more possibilities for you. So looking at these, we'll come back to this in a minute, because one thing that I think to look at is sensor sizes and crop factors, because depending on the lens that you choose to use, something that will often be talked about or mentioned is a crop factor. And when people talk about crop factors, what they're talking about is the way that when I take a lens that is on my full frame 35mm DSLR camera, and I take that same lens and I put it on my FS7, the field of view changes. On the DSLR, it's a nice big wide shot, but when I put it on the FS7, it's not as wide. And they're going to talk about a crop factor. So the way it's normally framed or phrased is my 50mm lens, when I put it on my full-frame DSLR is a 50mm lens, but when I put it on my FS7, it's no longer a 50mm lens, it becomes a 35mm lens. Well, that is incorrect. The lens is still a 50mm lens, and it doesn't matter what camera you put it on, it's always a 50mm lens. The crop factor is actually a measurement of the way the field of view is changing, not the focal length. And I think it is really important to get this into your head to understand this when you're talking about crop factors, is what's changing is not the lens, but what's changing is the size of the sensor, and because the size of the sensor changes, the field of view changes. The reason I bring this up is if you're talking to a cinematographer that's been working with 35mm film cameras all his life, for him a 35mm lens is a 35mm lens. He won't be thinking about crop factors and things like that. And if you start talking to somebody like saying, well, my 50mm is the equivalent to a 35, he really won't know what the hell you're talking about, because a 35mm lens is a 35mm lens. So why does the field of view change? It's very simple. If this is my if the picture you're seeing here, this shot of the castle, this Corfe Castle, represents the size of the sensor in a full-frame DSLR, if I put a 20mm lens on the full-frame DSLR, the image projected by the back of the lens, so that's the light falling off the lens, will fall on the sensor, and that's the image that we'll see. If I change the sensor, not the lens, if I change the sensor, so now the white box here represents a 2/3 inch, there's a small sensor, a 2/3 inch video camera sensor size. That's the field of view that you would get, a much smaller, narrower field of view. The lens is still the same lens, it's still a 20mm lens. So what's changed is the field of view, because the size of the sensor has changed, and the lens is still a 20mm lens. There's a 1/2 inch sensor there as well. So in all of these examples, the one thing that's changing is the size of the sensor, and because the size of the sensor is changing, the field of view is changing. So crop factor applies to the field of view. So the correct way to talk about crop factor is to say that the field of view becomes 1.5 times narrower, not that the focal length becomes 1.5 times longer. So that's what you need to at least have that in your head when you're thinking about crop factors and using different lenses on different sizes of sensors. So going back to lens adapters for a minute, straight through or optical. So the first thing to consider when we're adapting to use different lenses is whether the adapter is a straight through adapter or an optical adapter. So a PL mount adapter, your normal regular Metabones adapter, Comlite adapters, Nikon adapters, things like that, they are almost always a straight through adapter. There's no optical element in it, no glass. So the focal length and the aperture of the lens do not change. So our 20mm lens is still a 20mm lens. The second type of adapter is one that has optics in it, and that includes things like the speed booster, Metabone speed booster, the MTF-B4 lens adapter. These have optics in them. So these adapters, they actually do change the focal length of the lens because they are adding in additional optics. So in the case of an optical adapter, when you put a speed booster on the FS7, you are actually changing the focal length because you are adding optics. So you're no longer actually talking about an equivalent, you are actually changing the focal length. Speed booster makes lenses wider and makes the aperture effectively larger. The MTF-B4 adapter is the opposite. It makes the focal length longer by the equivalent of 2.6 times when you've included the doubler that you have to use, and also makes the aperture wider by this, the same amount. So when you're choosing a lens, zoom lenses or prime lenses. So a prime lens is any lens with a single focal length. It's not some special fancy type of lens. A prime lens just means a lens that is a single focal length, basically not a zoom lens. Prime lens optics are normally much simpler than zoom lenses, so there are normally much fewer aberrations, And generally speaking, you'll get much better contrast from a prime lens because of the simpler optical design. But it all does depend on the quality of the lens, because not all lenses are created equal. So a very, very poor quality or a poor quality prime lens may not perform as well as a good quality zoom lens. Zoom lenses offer greater flexibility as a rule, but generally, because the optical design is far more complicated, they have more aberrations and maybe a little bit less contrast, more reflections, more flare in the lens. But again, it really does depend on the quality of that individual lens. I'm looking. We have got a few questions in, but do keep asking questions. One of the questions that come up is actually about Samyang lenses, and we'll look at those in just a moment. So do keep sending questions in. So prime lenses, what are our options with prime lenses? Well, there are lots. Most of these are going to be with DSLR type lens mounts, but you could also use PL mount lenses. A lot of PL mount lenses are prime lenses. We have the Sony E-mount itself. So this is the mount that the camera has, its native mount. One of the really nice things about the E-mount is that the aperture control is virtually stepless. Now, I'm not sure exactly how small the steps are, but they are so small that if you operate the aperture during a shot, you won't normally notice those steps. It will appear to be a smooth aperture change. Nikon lens mounts, if you're using a Nikon DSLR lens mount, well, normally the adapters for these mechanically control the aperture, so that will give you, again, a stepless aperture control. I don't want to use the word issue, it's not the right word, but one thing just to be aware of with Nikon lenses is that compared to most broadcast lenses and most PL lenses is that Nikon lenses focus in the opposite direction. So infinity is, if you could see me, I'm turning my hand just trying to think which way we're going. Infinity is clockwise, whereas most broadcast lenses, infinity is anti-clockwise. Canon lenses, electronic aperture control on these for the majority. There are some mechanical ones around, but generally you're talking about electronic aperture control, and they work in steps, 1/8 of a stop step, or 1/4 of a stop step. And if you change your aperture mid-shot, you will see that step. It's quite noticeable, it's quite distracting, and it's not a good look. So one of the restrictions with a Canon electronic lens is you don't really want to change the aperture mid-shot. You can get around that with an ND fader on the front of the lens if you just need to adjust your exposure by a stop or two. A simple ND fader on the front of the lens can be used to do that during the shot and give you smooth aperture or smooth exposure control. Another benefit of Canon with the electronic lens control is generally if the lens has image stabilization, that will work. Just the other week I was doing a helicopter shot, and that came in really, really handy. I was able to use a Canon DSLR lens on my camera and use the electronic image stabilization to take out some of the vibration and the movement when shooting from the helicopter. So that was a real nice thing. Now, looking at a few examples of some prime lenses that are really nice on the FS7. The Zeiss Loxias, these are really nice E-mount lenses. So these are dedicated E-mount lenses, 35mm, 50mm f2. These are extremely sharp, crisp lenses, very small, compact, lightweight. They're gorgeous lenses to use. I really, really like these lenses, but they're not cheap, and a limited range of focal lengths. Another option, perhaps, is the Samyang Cine lenses. Now, I have almost the full set of these. I don't have the 10mm, it's the only one I don't have. And I really like these lenses. They are relatively low cost. These are normally available, they're available in E-mount or in Canon or Nikon. Personally, I would either go with the E-mount or Canon versions. They have a mechanical iris ring, so it's a stopless or stepless aperture adjustment, even in the Canon mount ones. So nice smooth aperture changes. The focus rings have around about 180 to 200 degrees of travel. So one of the things, a big issue actually with a lot of normal DSLR lenses, let's say a typical Canon DSLR lens, is that the focus ring has a very limited travel because most DSLR lenses are actually designed these days to work with autofocus. So mechanical focusing and manually focusing those lenses as a secondary consideration. To make the autofocus work quickly, you don't want to have a huge focus travel, because for autofocus to work quickly, you don't want to have to move the lens through 200 degrees or something like that. So autofocus lenses tend to have very, very small focus travel. That makes them really difficult to use manually. These Samyang lenses, no autofocus, designed to be used manually, so 200 to 180 degree of focus travel, really good focus travel. They are sharp. They are, one of the questions that's come in is, how sharp are they? I believe they are sharp enough for 4K. You have to remember that these are based on DSLR cameras. Nowadays, you're talking, or even when you're talking about film cameras, the resolution of 35mm film was 4K or beyond. A typical DSLR now, it's 26, 36, even 40 megapixels, way beyond 4K, yet these lenses still work quite well on those cameras. Sharpness can be your friend, it can also be your enemy. I've seen some lenses where they have been ultra sharp. Some of the master primes and ultra primes, things like that, really expensive lenses, super sharp, and sometimes the picture just perhaps doesn't look so nice because it's almost sharper than reality, I guess. Other lenses that are a little bit softer, what I would call a little bit more rounded, may not be quite so pin sharp, but represent the way I see the world a bit better, and as a result, I think give a nicer look. Now the Samyangs, they are very sharp. They are, I believe, good enough for 4K, as I said, and I really like them. The value for money they represent is phenomenal. Obviously, they're not the best lenses in the world. There are better lenses, but you'd have to spend quite a lot extra to get a better lens. Interestingly, Samyang have just announced a new line of lenses that are based on these lenses. They're Xeen lenses, spelled X-E-E-N, I think it is. And these are PL mount versions of these lenses. Now, by all accounts, it sounds like the PL versions use exactly the same optics, so it's the same optical design, so they won't necessarily be any sharper or have any higher resolution, but they do have new optical coatings, so there should be a little bit less flare and less aberrations, but they are 3-4 times the price of these Cine DSLR type versions. Samyangs I really like because they're just such good value for money. I think it's worth considering. The FS7, the camera is about £5,000, something like that. These lenses, you can buy the full set for about £3,000. A set of PL mount lenses with a similar range of focal lengths is going to cost you 2-3 times the cost of the camera. So you just have to sort of put things into some perspective. But at the same time, of course, lenses will probably outlive the life of the camera. So buy a good set of lenses now, and you'll be using them for many, many years to come, whereas the camera, like most cameras these days, will have to be replaced probably 2, 3, 4 years' time. PL mount lenses. Moving on to PL mount, well, lots and lots of options here. PL mount, they're cinema lenses generally, and you can start at something like the new Samyang Xeens, maybe £1,500 to £2,000 a lens, all the way up to master primes and cine primes where you're spending £20,000 for some of the really high-end lenses, as well as PL mount zooms, and the sky's the limit there. I mean, £40,000 for some of the high-end lenses. But you generally get what you pay for with lenses, and when you do sort of move into that £20,000 territory, you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck. One of the lenses I really like is the new Canon CN 17 times zoom lens, and in many respects that one lens can replace a whole range of prime lenses because it is so good, it's so sharp, the contrast is so good, but it costs as much as a set of prime lenses. So lots of options. Just one that's very commonly used, very popular with this type of camera is the Zeiss compact primes. These, again, they're essentially based on DSLR or still photo technology. That's very similar lens design to what you find in a DSLR, but repackaged, rehoused in a PL mount. Nice big lenses, so they're easy to get your hands around to grip, so it makes them easy to operate. Again, clickless iris. 270-degree focus travel, so very easy to focus. One comment actually on that is when you're pulling focus yourself, so if you've got your lens on the camera and you're trying to do a pull focus, sometimes a very large focus travel can go against you because you've got to turn the lens so far to pull focus from one point to another that it can actually be quite difficult to do. So sometimes a very big travel can work against you, but generally for most applications a large focus travel is beneficial because it does make getting precise focus that bit easier. And moving on, we also have, which we've got to talk about, the Sony 28 to 135mm zoom lens. I'm just going to answer a couple of questions that have come in before I go on to that. Can I recommend a good ND fader for Canon lenses? There's quite a few in the market now. I've always been a fan of the Genus ND faders. Each Genus ND fader is hand tested and hand checked. They are essentially handmade product and the quality is very, very good. So do check out the Genus brand. There are others as well, but it's one of those things, as with all things in life, the more money you pay, generally you do get a better quality fader. If you're buying an ND fader, don't skimp on it. Do spend the money, get a decent one. One of the issues you'll find with a lot of the cheaper ND faders is that they'll be fine with a wide angle lens or wider angles, maybe up to 50mm. But when you go beyond 50mm, you might start to see some softening of the image. And especially if you're going to 100, 150mm and the longer focal lengths, you really will see some extreme softening of the image with lower quality ND faders. So, have a look at the Genus ones. They're tested on a test bench. I think it's with a 150mm lens or something like that to check for any problems or any issues. And normally you do get a good quality filter from Genus. With all ND faders, the manufacturer will normally give you a recommended range to operate it within. That range might only be 6 or 7 stops, but the fader will actually give you more than that. The problem you get things called an extinction cross when you do go beyond the range that the manufacturer recommends. So if you really darken it a lot, you'll start to get some color artifacts and in some cases a cross-shaped effect in your picture. So do only try and use your ND fader within the range that it's designed to be used within. A decent ND fader will have that marked on the outside of the fader, normally a series of dots or something, and a min and a max point. Don't go beyond those. If your ND fader doesn't have that marked on it, then I wouldn't probably use it. It probably is a cheap one and it's probably going to be not so good. All the decent ones will have that maximum range marked on the ND filter. So we've got a few more questions that we will come on to. While we're talking about ND faders, Samyang lenses, what do you advise regarding external ND filters? Well, actually, that's not just Samyang lenses. That is a general, again, I don't like using the word issue because it makes it sound like there's something wrong with the camera, but a concern with the FS7 because it is ridiculously sensitive. If you're using the Cine EI mode, 2000 ISO, and it's a really bright sunny day, even with all the ND filters in the camera wound in, it's very difficult to get a nice wide aperture so you can have a nice shallow depth of field. So you're going to want to use some external ND filters. Now, one of the accessories, obviously, that a lot of people like to put on their cameras, I'll just skip forward a slide here, is a matte box. And matte boxes, they're not just there because they look fancy and they look cool, which they do. They do make the camera look purposeful and make it look like a film camera as opposed to a general purpose video camera. They are there to hold your filters. And the other thing they are there to do, of course, is to shade the lens. Just sidetracking a little bit, one of the things that really affects how sharp your pictures are is contrast. And one of the things that can really reduce the contrast in your image is stray light entering the lens. And that's where a really good matte box can really help you out. This is one of the smaller Vocus ones, and I can't remember the exact product number. I like this matte box because it is compact, it's not very big, But it also, if you look at the picture, you can see that inside there is an aperture mask, and that's a 16:9 aperture mask in the front of the matte box, and that really does cut down on the amount of stray light that enters the lens, and that will keep your contrast up and make your pictures look sharper. It's one of the things where the Samyangs are a little weak is their optical coatings are not the best in the world, and they really do benefit from being well shaded. It will bring the contrast and sharpness up very nicely. Anyway, back to ND filters. So one of the, I guess, best value ways of using ND filters is to use a matte box. If you get some 4x4 or 4x6 ND filters, you can use those with any lens then. They'll normally cover the majority of lenses, and you don't need to have different screw-on filters and adapters for each different size of lens that you've got. So I would strongly recommend investing in a matte box and a set of ND filters. A 0.8 would be the one I would start with, and use that matte box with an ND filter as a starting point. Sometimes though, if you're run and gun, you might want to be a bit more portable. Matte boxes can be bulky, they can get big and weighty, so you might want to use screw-on filters. One way to do that is to get a set of large screw-on ND filters, probably go with some Tiffin IR ND filters, especially if you're going for a very strong ND filter. You really want to have an IR cut ND filter. One of the things that you get with a very, very strong ND filter, the majority of conventional ND filters let through infrared light. They are optical filters. They will filter out the optical spectrum, but still let through some infrared. And what will happen if you're using a very strong external ND filter, there isn't enough IR suppression in the filter, so you will start to get color shifts in the red part of the far red part of the spectrum when using very strong ND filters with this camera. So really, for very strong amounts of ND, anything above a 0.8, you want to have an ND that includes IR cut to avoid that color shift. And I really like the Tiffin ones. They're certainly the ones I use and can recommend. There are others available from other manufacturers as well that are also very good. Tiffin's just ones that I know, so I trust them. Going back to screw-on filters, with a screw-on filter, one of the ways to save some money is to buy a large filter, 82mm or larger, and then use step-down rings so you can use your filters on a wide range of lenses. I think it's a mistake just to buy, if you've got a lens where the front filter is, let's say 72mm, to buy 72mm ND, because then if you get a lens with an 82mm front, you're going to have to buy another set of NDs. So start large, big ND filters, 82mm, and then get step-down rings so you can use them on a wide range of lenses rather than restricting those ND filters to just one or two lenses. So moving on to where were we? The 28 to 135mm zoom lens. Is it the best lens in the world? Absolutely no, it really isn't. Is it value for money? I think it's fantastic value for money. Yes, please, 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 Sony, make a wider lens. 28 to 135 is actually surprisingly useful. I think it's worth considering that with a 2/3 inch ENG lens, many years ago, the standard lens would have been a 9mm 14 times zoom lens, so 9mm at the wide end, which on a Super 35 sensor, and I know I'm saying this the wrong way round, would have the effective field of view of around about a 24mm lens. So 28 to 135 isn't actually that much longer than what used to be the normal with a 2/3 inch camera a few years ago. Of course, wide-angle lenses in recent years became much cheaper. So with ENG lenses, it was quite common then to get sort of 8mm, 7mm, 6mm lenses, which are significantly wider than the 28 to 135. But as an all-round general purpose lens, it really isn't that bad. Image quality optically, it's actually rather good. It really surprises me how good it is when you consider how much it costs. I mean, effectively this lens is about £2,000 thereabouts. It's parfocal and it's f4. Now to get a parfocal lens that is 4 times with that constant f4 The nearest equivalent to that is the Fujinon Cabrio, and that's a 20,000, 25,000 pound lens. So in terms of value for money, it really is very good. I do wish it was wider though, but it's a very usable lens, very useful to have in your tool set. Autofocus can sometimes be handy. As a cameraman with 25 years of manual focusing, I never thought I'd actually really say that on an ENG type lens, on a traditional, on a video camera, that autofocus is useful. But sometimes it can be, especially at 4K, when you're just trying to get that last tiny bit of focus. Sometimes the focus assist function in the camera can be quite nice. I don't use it as default. By default, I use it manually, but just every now and again, it is nice to have autofocus for a few shots here and there. So I think that 28-235 is great value. If my pockets were deep enough, I would have that Canon 17 times zoom lens. It's I can't remember the photo. It's 17 millimeters to 17 to 120, I think it is, if I remember right. Yeah, 17 to 120, great range, but it's best part of 30,000 quid. So it's a serious investment. There's lots and lots of rumors about what's going to come from Sony. I have no knowledge of what is coming on the lens front from Sony, but my suspicion would be that there will be a wide angle to complement this lens. I think they'd be crazy not to, but one of the things that happens is when you make a lens wider, it becomes harder to get that same zoom ratio. So let's say Sony bring out an 18 millimeter to something. It's not going to be a 4.8 times zoom. It's probably going to be a 3.5 times zoom, something like that. So we're probably going to be looking at an 18 to 75 or something like that. But if, and it is an if, I don't know, if Sony were to bring out something like an 18 to 75, and then you had this 28 to 135 as well, that would cover most bases for a lot of people and would be quite a nice way to go. So Sony, if you are listening, and I suspect there might be some people from Sony listening, please do bring us a nice wide angle zoom. My feeling is that we will get one. Looking at other accessories for the camera, and then we'll come around to answering some of more of your questions in it. And please keep those questions coming in. We don't have a lot of them, so either I've bored you all silly or you know all the answers to everything, but I am here to answer your questions, so keep those questions coming in. Other things to accessorize and add to your camera. Well, this is my typical shooting kit here in this picture. And various things bolted onto the camera. Let's have a look at a few of those things. It's the other side of the camera, and why I have them and why I think they're useful. Well, the first thing, the lens mount, the viewfinder mount. I'm really not quite sure what Sony were thinking or doing when they developed the lens mount on this camera, because I think it's really just about barely usable. I would replace the lens mount. This is the Vocus one. There are others from companies like Sakuto and people like that, so there are quite a few choices. The Vocus one allows you to slide the viewfinder forwards and backwards without it tilting and drooping, which is the biggest problem with the Sony mount. The viewfinder just has a tendency to droop. And it's really very usable. You can still flip the viewfinder around to the side, so you can work from the side. It's not particularly expensive, and I really would sort of urge everybody to ditch the Sony viewfinder mount and replace that viewfinder mount with something other than the Sony one. Almost all the third-party ones are better than the Sony one. And it really does actually make a huge difference to the way the camera feels when you use it, when your viewfinder isn't all saggy and droopy, and it really helps you shoot better and keep that horizon nice and level. So I really recommend that. A base plate. Again, this is the Vocus base plate on here. Lots and lots of choices. Vocus, Sakuto, Shape, wooden camera, all sorts of varieties. This particular Vocus one I quite like because it follows the curve of the base of the camera. The downside to that is you can't move the camera forwards and backwards, but it does keep the camera on your shoulder very low profile. It keeps the center of gravity down. And as you can see here, I've got an external battery plate on the back of my rig using a V-Lock battery, and that really helps me balance the camera. So because this particular plate does place the camera quite far forwards, it is good to have a battery on the back to balance the camera out. And by using a V-mount battery, I can use readily available V-mount batteries. These ones are the PAG-Link batteries, which are really superb. Get that camera balance just right by moving the battery forwards and backwards on those little short rods at the back. Makes the camera a delight to use on your shoulder. I've also got a Vocus hand grip on the left side of the camera, so I can hand hold the camera a bit easier. Sometimes that's more or less useful. It's nice to be able to hold the camera steadily and securely, but then I can't focus the camera. I have to take my hand off that hand grip to focus the camera. I did play with the Zacuto, what do they call it? It's a recoil rig the other day, and they had their Tornado focus thing, which is like a hand grip that you can actually hold the camera with, and it's also a follow focus, and that's a really nice little piece of kit, so well worth investigating that. Other things, so I've got a base plate. The other thing I've added is a little top plate here, a cheese plate. Again, this is the Vocus one, but again there are others from many other manufacturers, and this it's just handy to be able to add extra accessories. If you look at the front of this cheese plate, you'll see there's a 15mm rod mount there. So instead of mounting my viewfinder off the rod on the top of the hand grip, if I want, I can also mount it down there for some applications. That's quite a handy little feature. But I can hang my magic arms for my Convergent Design Odyssey or whatever onto that top cheese plate. Lots and lots of mounting points. Not an expensive item. With this particular one, you retain the standard hand grip, which is nice because then you still have the MI shoe for connecting a radio mic or putting the XLR, 2x XLR breakout box on there, and the GPS and everything else still works. If you take that hand grip off, it is worth remembering you lose the MI shoe, you lose the GPS and a few other little functions. So I quite like to keep the standard Sony handle there. Batteries that I'm using, mentioned it briefly, PAG links, these are great. You can stack them, have multiple batteries, so if you need a bit more weight on the back, you can do that. They have a wonderful little micro charger. We've got a question actually coming in about transporting camera and things like that. I travel a lot. The micro charger is one of these plug-in wall warts. You just plug it into the wall, very, very small, because I can stack 2 or 3 batteries together, even with this little wall wart, the little black boxes that plug into the wall. I can charge 3 batteries at once, so overnight I can charge 2 or 3 batteries. They'll be fully charged in the morning with a charger that weighs nothing. Is so easy to transport. All airline approved and everything else, so no problems with airport security and things like that with these batteries, so I really like those. Anyway, so coming on to answering questions from you guys. Do I know if Sony plan to develop the FS7 so you can adjust the VF zoom area? The answer is I don't know. My suspicion it would be sadly no. The F5 and F55 cameras, very, very similar to the FS7. They've been around now for 3 years, and we don't have that function in those more expensive cameras. The basic technology that's in the FS7 is largely the same as the F5, so I really, unfortunately, don't think we'll ever have the ability to move that zoom area around. I just don't think there's enough processing power in the camera. I could be wrong. Someone's just commented, what a shame I can on my A7S, and I agree completely. It is a shame, and I wish they could. I could be wrong. Maybe they will. It's been asked, and guys, trust me, Sony do listen to us. I know a lot of people on other forums say, oh, Sony don't listen, they don't care. They do. There are various cultural things going on and political things within Sony in the background that mean that there are some restrictions as to how they can respond to us and answer us on forums and websites and things like that for legal reasons and all sorts. But they do listen. And our comments, our requests, our feature requests, they are taken on board. Now, I'm in a very privileged position. I have a very close working relationship with Sony. I meet a lot of the development engineers from Japan, and I talk to them. And before we've even started the discussion, they'll tell me this, Alistair, so many people have been asking for this function. Do you think it's a good idea? And normally I'll say yes, because it's very rare that people ask for silly things. So I can hear that they are listening to us. They are taking on board what we want. But they're things do take time to develop, and they don't have infinite manpower. So sometimes we have to be a little bit patient and wait for stuff. Talking about the viewfinders, I did try the Zacuto Gratical very recently. I'm doing a video review on it, and all I can say is wow. If you want to improve the viewfinder on the FS7, that's the way to do it. Get yourself a Gratical, put it on there, you won't regret it. What you can do with that viewfinder is amazing. It really is just about the best viewfinder I've ever used, and it really blew me away, and it does transform the camera. So yeah, it's not cheap, but a really good sound investment. So other questions. Is large sensor, there was loads of questions have suddenly came in and they've just moved. Okay, is large sensor really likely to replace 2/3 inch ENG cameras? Ooh, that's a great question. I wish I could tell you the answer categorically. I don't think it will. I don't think it will ever replace 2/3 inch, a traditional 2/3 inch ENG camera, and the reason I don't think it will is because of zoom ratios. It is ridiculously expensive to design and create a lens with a very, very wide zoom range that's reasonably fast for a large sensor. As I mentioned, that 17 to 120mm Canon lens, it's best part of £30,000. Yes, as demand for that type of lens increases, those prices will drop, but it's still only a 7 times zoom. It's not the 14, 20, 24, 30 times, whatever zoom ratios that we've become used to with the ENG cameras. And I think for that reason alone, 2/3 inch ENG cameras will continue to exist and continue to be very important. Having said that, though, I think that large sensor cameras, Super 35, things like that, are going to make a bigger and bigger and bigger impact on that market. 2/3 inch possibly will become much more niche for documentary and news, while large sensor takes over everywhere else, corporate video, things like that. Large sensor, I think, is going to become the dominant form factor. So I think a lot of corporate factor, obviously drama, high-end documentary. I think large sensor will be the dominant format in the future. Next question, can you go lower than 2000 ISO on the FS7 in custom mode? Well, yes, you can, but it depends on which gamma curves that you're using. So if you're using S-Log, using ISO, and I've got to think about this because I don't use custom mode very often, I don't think you can go below 2000 ISO, but if you were to use the standard gammas, they're 800 ISO, so you can do it that way. Hyper gammas as well, 800 ISO, so that's one way to get a lower ISO. Can I use the servo on a B4 lens like a Canon HJ21, and how do they perform? Yes, you can use the servo. The way you do it is you get a power adapter cable to go from a 12-volt power source to the lens. Now, this is one of the reasons why I like to use V-mount batteries on the camera, because I can put my V-mount batteries on the back. I can plug in a DTAP or something like that to power things like a servo on a zoom lens. You can also get batteries from Swit and people like that will go directly into the back of the FS7 that have a DTAP on them, and you can power that way. And Sony also make a version of the BPU 60 and 90 that has a high-rose 4-pin power connector on it, so you can power the lens that way, so that will power the servo. And that gives you a silky smooth servo just as you'd have on your 2/3 inch lens. Now, in terms of optical quality, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting, because and we're actually overrunning a little bit now. Optically wise, the optical limitation will be the lens. Most 2/3 inch B4 lenses, frankly, compared to a cine lens, are rubbish. The optical quality just isn't there because it hasn't needed to be there, because most 2/3 inch cameras have a big fat optical block with a prism in it that degrades the image quality anyway, so they only have to reach a certain quality level with those zoom lenses to be able to match what the cameras can deliver. And unfortunately, one of the things that most people find is when they put a 2/3 inch ENG lens on an FS7, F5, whatever, with whatever adapter, the pictures look remarkably like they did off their 2/3 inch camera. They don't basically look any different, which people find disappointing because they expect to get something better. But you don't. You end up basically with a like-for-like picture. What it does give you, though, is the flexibility of owning just one camera, let's say the FS7, being able to use it one day with prime lenses for your interviews and for your really important stuff, and then slap a 2/3 inch lens on there when you need that zoom lens. Let's say you're shooting motor racing or an air show where things are coming and going from you and you need a zoom. So moving on, 1.5 times crop factor. Is the 28 to 100 35 equal to a 35 to 200 mm? Well, yes, more or less. The focal, the range of field of view that you'll get is the same as a 35 millimeter at the wide end. So it's not particularly wide. It's sort of a standard lens, really. Off topic, how do I transport the camera, as there's so many elements projecting from the body? It's hard to find a container to travel with the camera. I fly a lot. My camera goes in a carry-on bag. It is wrapped in, basically it's just actually wrapped in a very thick, it's like a foam material. It's a packing material. I wrap around it. So far nothing's broken off the camera. I do try and treat it with some respect. It is pretty tough, the camera. I had water poured all over it accidentally and it survived that just fine. Really just sort of pack it, pad it. Ideally get a foam insert made for it to protect it properly, and that would be really good. Any news as to when Sony will introduce a center crop function that they've promised? No, I unfortunately don't know when that's going to come. I would imagine probably be announced sometime around IBC. Mag area preview is so tantalizing. Yes, yeah, I will. Yeah, I wish we could have it. What zoom lenses would I recommend? For a wide-angle lens, DSLR lens, I love the 18 to 35 millimeter Tamron art lens. It's a beautiful lens, really lovely pictures off that. Basically replaces my 18 to 35 primes. It's that good. And then something like a Canon L series, the 24 to 105 f4 is very popular, and that seems to be a really good lens. Give you a nice wide zoom range, a very useful zoom range, one lens, f4 constant aperture. It isn't parfocal, but it's fairly parfocal, so you can do some small zooms without the focus shifting. Is there a decent short zoom E-mount you could recommend that still give a shallow depth of field? Well, not really. The problem is, as soon as you go to zoom lenses, you start losing that wide aperture. So again, maybe some of 24 to 104, the Canon L series, that again would be a lens worth looking at. Something in that sort of range. I'm considering upgrading from an AF101 Micro Four Thirds to FS7. Will lenses be redundant or any use? Well, you won't be able to use your 4/3 lenses on the FS7. You'll have to use lenses designed for Super 35, APS-C or Canon or full frame lenses. What about, what else we got? Can I recommend a good backpack that you can transport your FS7 rig almost ready to shoot? I don't use backpacks. I do know that Vocus makes some very nice ones, so do take a look at the ones that Vocus provide. What EF long lenses do I recommend? What I have is I'm just trying to think what I use. I don't tend to use that many long lenses. One lens I use a lot though is the new, is the Tokina 18 to 270 super zoom lens. Surprisingly good. It does focus back to front. All the Tokinas focus the Nikon direction, but it's actually surprisingly sharp throughout the whole range. It's not constant aperture. It does go down to f6.3 at the long end, but it gives you 18 to 270 millimeter range in one lens. It's giving you that almost sort of ENG style 18 times zoom range, which is fantastic to have. It's not parfocal, so you do have to refocus when you zoom, but it means you haven't got to keep swapping and chopping and changing lenses, and I really do actually quite like that lens. Also the Sigma 18 to 200 is again another nice lens. Lots more questions coming in, but we really are running out of time. We will email back and try and respond to the questions that are outstanding. There's a few here, and we'll try and sort of tack those on in an email and get those to you, so no questions go unanswered, but we have a very limited time frame on here. Can we use those last 3 minutes, do you think?
I think so, yeah.
We might end up
Carry
getting
on.
cut off. If we suddenly disappear, it's because we've run out of time. Comlight or Metabones, big price difference? Yes, big price difference, but in terms of functionality, both pretty much exactly the same if you're just talking about the straightforward electronic adapter, excluding the optical one. So the Comlight EF adapter and the Metabones one, I find functionality pretty much the same for both of those, and in fact in some cases the Comlight will work where the Metabones doesn't, but the Comlight is much cheaper. Both actually quite well made, no problems with build quality. Is there an accessory to attach a servo drive to a DSLR zoom lens? Many people have looked at this. I've looked at developing this. There's a patent issue. Somebody does actually have a patent on doing that, but they never actually brought out the product, which is a great shame. It is being looked at. It is possible, but whether it would be affordable is another thing, because we looked at pricing and we'd probably be looking at 1,500 to £2,000 for such an adapter just to add a servo motor that works reliably on DSLR zoom lens, but it doesn't get around the fact that the DSLRs are not parfocal, so you will have focus issues. As you zoom in and out, you'll have to change your focus. Z Finder, a good substitute for the supplied EVF? No, the Z Finder, not so sure about that. I really would aim for the Gratical or the new lower cost version of the Gratical that's coming out. Why don't I use custom mode much? I just prefer the flexibility that I can get by shooting in S-Log and doing my grading work in post-production, even if it simply means shooting in S-Log and slapping a LUT on my footage rather than grading just one LUT, apply it to the whole project in post. Takes a few seconds to do, very quick, very easy. Beauty of that though is if I change my mind, I just change the LUT. You shoot something in custom mode, you bake the look in, you're tied to that look, that's it, that's what you get. To really sort of greatly change that look is very difficult. So I just prefer that flexibility that I get in the Cine EI mode. If you haven't used Cine EI mode, if you don't use it, do try it. Do give it some time to grow on you. It's not something you can just, I think, use on the first shoot and think that's wonderful. I think it takes a little bit of time to sort of get into the routine and the swing of how you use it. So really that is it. We are out of time. I hope you found the session useful. Thanks for listening. Thanks for all the great questions. I'll just hand over to Rob to quickly wind up.
Yes, thanks very much, Alistair. As normal, use the maximum amount of time, which is brilliant, giving you guys some fantastic information. I'm sure you'll agree with me. So as Alistair said, thanks for listening and joining in and taking part, giving us lots of questions. Hope to see you or speak to you again soon. Bye for now.